a couple of years ago, the buzz phrase was the data is the new oil. And so a lot of the most valuable tech companies, the most valuable ecosystems are based around data. It's, it's ads, it's AI, it's these kind of things. And in order for the crypto ecosystem to play into that, we need to have privacy tools. And most of these have latency as an important component. So low latency privacy is kind of the thing we're going after. And that's exactly what TEEs strive to achieve. And what Flashbots is working on is sort of using that to facilitate interactions and coordination between different actors. And MEV is exactly that. You have people with different interests, and we're trying to get them all to play together.
Okay, so welcome to today's episode of the Canonical Pod. Today, very excited to have Quintus with us, who's a researcher at Flashbots. And Fahad and I have been wanting to know about TEEs a lot, and we figured that Quintus is our guy. So, let's just jump straight into it, Quintus. Can you please explain to us what the heck a TEE is?
Sure. So from the highest level going down, a TEE is a security primitive that is generally operates at a way lower latency than other primitives, and gives you assurances about computations that it's done correctly, that it's done confidentially in some sense. How it's implemented is
so how does that compare to how does that compare to a ZK proof? Is it similar?
Right.
Wait, hold on. Actually, before you answer that, because it's possible some people will not even know what you mean by security primitive, and it's possible that this guy doesn't know what exactly you mean by security primitive.
Okay. You know what? Let me tell you concretely what we're talking about, and then we can talk about why it's a security primitive. Okay, so it's easy to talk about what Intel does because Intel owns or does most of the stuff in the chip manufacturing supply chain. But Intel will design a chip, and they'll design this chip with some security properties in mind, and they have been doing this. And then they'll manufacture these, and in each of these chips, they'll insert a private key, burn it into the hardware physically, and then keep track on a registry of all of the public keys that correspond to these chips that they've made.
From one private key?
No. Each chip will have its own
private public
key.
pair.
Yeah, it's a little bit more complicated, but that's the best way of thinking about it. Each chip has its own key pair. And what this now allows us to do is we can load software into this chip, and the chip will use this private key to sign the software and say, hey, I am running this software, and you can then send off this certificate, right, the signed commitment to the software, to someone else who doesn't have physical access to the hardware. And they can look at the certificate, compare it, ask Intel, hey, does this signature match? Do you have is this in your registry? And there's different ways of implementing this. They can make the registry public. They could sign certificates ahead of time. It doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, you're asking Intel and say, hey, Intel, is this a legitimate TEE chip? And they say yes. And you go, great. And then you say, then you're interacting with this chip, even if you're interacting with them remotely. And you can do this you can interact with this software running on the chip in a private way. Because when the TEE signs this software, it'll also create a new key pair that's specific to this software and say, hey, look, I'm basically creating this program as a sort of independent entity, and it owns this private key. So now anyone who receives a certificate knows that if they encrypt data to this program's private key, they will be able to interact with it privately. And so it's as if they have this end-to-end encrypted connection with another person, except it's not a person, it's a program running the TEE.
Wait, hold on. When you say it'll interact privately, is that because of the fact that you can tell that it's related to that public key, private key pair associated with a particular program?
Yes. Okay. So let me be a bit more specific about the security, because there's definitely some cryptographers listening to this who are easily triggerable by people talking about TEEs. So there's a couple of different things that we want to keep confidential here. The last thing I was talking about was the interaction between the remote user and this program running on the TEE. And that interaction should be private from a party who is intercepting these messages because they're encrypted. Maybe the party will know, okay, at this point in time, a message has flowed between them, but it shouldn't be able to decrypt the messages in the same way that when I send a message on WhatsApp, no one in the middle should be able to read what the message is. The more complex part about TEE security is what happens when someone is actually trying to go after the program itself on the chip. And there are two ways that people can do this. They can do it by running other software on the same chip and having that software sort of attack the program that we're trying to keep confidential. Or they can
What do you mean by attack? What do you mean by attack in that context?
So,
like in the execution, look for like flaws in logic or something.
But
that's more
about
like
two
an
programs
exploit.
essentially on the same TE, right?
Yes.
And somehow the second one is interfering with the first one.
Yes. Okay. So there are obviously there's a large class of things that you could do.
Wait, can I take a step back, because there was a question I had earlier that I held in. Which which was, if you take so the idea that there will be some private key signing something, whatever, right? That seems simple enough. Yeah. And that would then, so just like even very simple things like signing a message, right? I can verify that this message was signed by the private key associated with a particular public key. This doesn't require any sort of complication, TE, etc., right? But here, one of the key pieces seems to be, I think, that at least the applications that I think I'm familiar with, it's relevant not just that it's being signed by this private key, but that the software is something of a particular nature, right? Like the whole reason we're doing this is because I want to make sure that it's a particular program that is being run, right? And so the idea that, let's say, the TEE's private key is signing wouldn't necessarily tell me what the content, or that the content of the program that they're running is of a particular nature. And now you did talk about the private public key for the program, but that also, it's not clear to me, like, in principle, you could have something, you could generate, like, for instance, a brand new private key public key pair without any, like, give me some source of randomness and I will generate a new ECDSA pair. And I don't know if the stuff is for the program is being signed by the program private key or whatever, but the point is, like, I guess what I'm saying is, where does the assurance that the particular software is being run show up? Because it seems to me that's a little bit different than a particular private key happening to have signed it.
Okay, we'll come back to the software attacks. So to answer your question, I don't know if maybe this addresses your uncertainty. If it doesn't, then just throw the question again. But you can think of the TE as from when you turn it on. Basically, you turn on the TE, and then there'll be some like very basic software that just like starts it up, and this is like coded into the chip, and that will measure and say, okay, they've deployed this operating system, for example, and basically what it'll do is it'll take that code and hash the operating system, and say, okay, well, this is the operating system, this is the data associated with it, and this gives me this particular hash. And now we're going to use the chip's private key to sign this hash. And now whatever software we've measured, we can associate a key with that as well. And then that software can go and do something else, measure something else, or whatever it is, launch a new program, and maybe associate other keys with that. We can just keep building on this hierarchy. But the important point is that from a remote observer's perspective, all you're getting is a signed hash. And the most simple way of using this is just to say, okay, well, we expect that what the code that's being measured, the logic that's being measured, is open source, so that the remote verifier can then say, okay, well, I've received this hash. Let me go to the GitHub repo, clone it, do what's called a reproducible build, where I do the exact same steps, hash the software in the same way, and then see, do I get the same hash? If I get the same hash, then I know, okay, the code that's on this GitHub repo is the same code that's running in this TEE, as long as the TEE security model holds.
Okay, so wait, it's just like old school, just like regular. If you were to encrypt a message with a like sign it, sorry, like if you were to sign a message, I take the message and the key, and I can perform a signature, and then Fahad can say like, oh, I have the message also. How do I verify that Brad signed it? Well, I can do the same signature, like what do you call it? Basically, sign the message the same way and say, oh, this is how I verify that Brad, like, that's how you verify that Brad actually signed it. But now you're doing it to, instead of a message, you're doing it to a program. Is that?
Well, we're talking about hashing, right? It's like a little bit different
Yeah.
from signatures. And signatures, you have
Yeah.
it's asymmetric. You have a private and a public key.
Okay.
The public key can only do the verification. Whereas
Yeah.
here we're just talking about hashing. So, but exactly right. You're repeating the same operation. So on the TEE side, some operation will be carried out, and it'll produce a hash. And a hash is like a commitment to the software. It's very unlikely, basically, impossible for the purpose of this argument, that someone can find some other data
Software
that can be hashed to the same hash.
Got it. Okay.
Wait,
Yeah.
okay, so I think I followed your answer, but let me ask another question that will clarify that, which is that, so could you clarify the input output for a particular case? So let's say there's a TEE, we have some software now uploaded to the TEE, right? And now let's say Brad is going to essentially, he wants to run the program through the TEE with some input. Let's forget about like encryption of the input, whatever, right now. So the idea is there is some software on this TEE, and Brad wants to execute the software. And so first of all, I guess the input is just whatever is the input to the program that he's executing. Again, like forget about the encryption and so on. Like let's not worry about people intercepting stuff. So first of all, is that correct? And second of all, then what is the output? Because here is maybe where like the hash of the software shows up and the signature. And part of what I'm trying to understand is like, is there even any interaction between that? Like, is it just, look, I'm going to output the hash of the software that I was running, which will serve as evidence that I did run the software, right? Essentially because the hash function is whatever, collision resistant, etc. And at the same time, I'll provide a signature, or meaning the TE will provide a signature, which will verify essentially that it is actually coming from that TE. But you see, like even the way I framed that there was that the evidence that it's coming from the TE is separated from the fact that the software is of a particular nature, which is fine, but that's already slightly different conceptually than if somehow the hash of the software itself was signed or something like that. So could you just clarify what the output is from this?
So there's multiple steps, right? The remote verifier will first just receive the certificate. And there's all sorts of protocols you can build around this, but at the base they're like verifying that the certificate is legit. And once they've done this,
what is the certificate in terms of like what data is it?
Yeah, I mean there's like other. It's a series of hashes and metadata that's
hashes
signed.
Of what?
But you can think of it as one hash of the code that's running on the TEE.
Okay, but so no signature there. Just it's essentially
no. You have to sign. So the TEE private key has to sign the hash. Otherwise, anyone could just send the hash to the user, and they could be running on their like malicious. They could be sitting there on their MacBook Pro, pretending to be a TEE and lying about the software they're running. Right. So the TEE needs to sign the hash of the code, and the TEE is constructed so that key will only sign code that's running on the TEE. It's not going to sign something else.
But wait. So the software itself isn't changing based on what the user is prompting it, right? So for instance, like if I see the signature with any particular private key of the same thing, then I could myself just like reproduce it, right? Because it's the same thing every time. So where's presumably there has to be something that that's changing from execution to execution, right? As to what has to be output.
Yeah, you can have a stateful program. The attestation will measure the initial conditions, and then you get like more complex schemes where you do like dynamic attestations, where you attest to the state of the program at some intermediate point. But if it's constructed correctly, you only need to measure the initial point to like get the identity of the program. It's like, this is the program. And then, okay, here's a basic example. You can imagine a program that just does like some counting, and you initialize it and say, look, here I'm attesting that I have a program that like receives an input, increments some counter starting at 0, and then returns the value of the counter. That's all it does. And you can measure and say, like, originally this is the program that I'm launching, it starts at 0, and then people can interact with it and the value of the counter will increase. And the initial attestation is not going to tell someone, several iterations down the line, what the exact value of the counter at the TEE is. You could try build a system to do that, but the basic primitive is just telling you what the initial starting state is.
Right. No, but okay. So let me. So I think I'm misunderstanding what the output is. So I'll tell you, like in my framing of what the problem is. So if what's being signed is literally just the source code of the program, which isn't changing from execution to execution, and say, for instance, separately the output is being provided, then I could, for instance, see the first signature, be like, okay, so this is what the private keys, this is what this TE's private key signing that software is. And I could then pretend that, like, the next time somebody calls it, I give like a nonsensical output, but I show you the correct private key signature of the software. So presumably the signing is also like the signature is on top of also the output somehow, right? Or like
yeah. So the first phase is this like certificate exchange. Then remember we said in that certificate we associate with the code that's being hashed some key pair as well. And so now this remote user can interact with this software using that with this attested program using this key pair. And if they do that, then if they form an encrypted channel, and the way they form this encrypted channel means that only the program and they have the keys that correspond to this secure channel. So if they're receiving messages on the secure channel, it must mean that on the other end of it is the program that's been attested.
Right, sure, no, but I think the step I'm missing is that certificate exchange, and the reason I'm missing it is because I'm saying if the certificate is just a signature of something static, then
I don't think
instance,
it's static.
Right, that's my point.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
What is that? Because the program itself is not going to change, right? If it was literally a signature if the certificate was literally a signature of a program that's static, then anybody who receives a certificate could provide the certificate to somebody else. Is I guess what I'm saying.
But I think you said it's a program and the state. So right. So the state is changing each time you interact with it.
Yeah.
Quintus, you can tell us.
So I
interpret it wrong?
I think I'm failing to grok the question fully. And I think your point was, look, if we have some TE, we have a remote user, we send the certificate to the remote user, that remote user can then reuse the certificate. Is that the...
No, like if I was a malicious party, right, and I could see what Fahad sent you, then I could just copy that and I can start interacting with you. And I'm like, no, I'm the T.
Yeah, but you won't be able to because the certificate contains keys that are only available in the TEE. So anyone who sees the certificate will encrypt their messages to these keys. And so no middle party will be able to read those messages because they're encrypted to a key they don't have. And in that message exchange, the initial exchange will establish another key pair that again can only belong to the TE program or to the remote user. So that at no point is there someone in the middle who has the right material to be able to meaningfully derive information from the exchange messages.
So Quintus, I think you actually had the framing of my question correct. So to take a step back to that, then so I'm interacting with the TE. We're trying to establish the initial channel. Okay, so what happens first? Does the TE send me a certificate first?
Yeah, there's different ways of implementing it, but that's the basic thing. You say
But that certificate, is it something static? Like, so for instance, again, like if it was just a signature of a static piece of code, then it wouldn't change, for instance, if the TE was interacting with Brad next, right? It would be the same certificate. So if I interact with the TE and receive the certificate, and then I send the certificate to Brad trying to pose as the TE.
Yeah, that certificate. Okay, so earlier I said it's a signature of a hash, and then I added a qualification to make that a little bit more complicated. It's a signature over a hash and a public key. And the public key is from a public-private key pair that's associated with the software that's been hashed, with the attested software. So if you then send that signature to Brad, that certificate to Brad, he'll go, oh, okay, cool, this is a TE. Let me encrypt my messages to this public key that's in the certificate, which you don't have. And so you can't pull off this man-in-the-middle attack because that key pair resides in the TE. And so you just be getting these encrypted messages and not be able to do anything with them. Maybe you can forward them to the TE.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm impressed. I feel like
that helped a lot. That helped a lot.
I've spoken to a bunch of security people about this, to people who spend their time doing cryptography, and I feel like we don't get into the weeds as much. So I'm impressed for two econ guys.
I'm not an econ guy. Yeah.
But I feel like you spend your time on the econ side of things.
Yeah. No, but I think maybe you guys take for granted what assumptions that we don't really think about. So yeah. So that was useful.
Yeah. Okay. We took this big detour.
Yeah. We'll have to go back to the programs attacking each other, right?
Yeah. No, I think it's good that we did this detour. It's helping me refine the TLDR. But okay, so what do we have? We have a chip. Chip is made with some security properties. We'll come back to those. The chip allows a remote user to have some confidence that a specific program is running on this TE and inherits the security properties of the TE. And we assume the program is open source, so the user knows actually what the logic is. And they can interact with it in this secure channel so that no one else is listening. It's just them and the program. Now, where's all the complexity? The complexity lies in protecting this program running on the TE from potential adversaries. I say we have basically two kinds of adversaries. We have the software adversary, which is the weaker kind, and then you have the physical adversary who's there with their toolkit ready to take this thing apart. And the software adversary is the thing you'll read the most about. That's what most of the research goes into, and it makes sense because there's several billion people with access to software. There's only a couple who can actually physically reach the chip. And it's much harder to do the physical attacks, but we can come back to that. The software attacks, you asked, how does that happen? A lot of this comes down to the design of the chip, and you can avoid a lot of these kinds of attacks by just designing the chip in a different way. But the core of the idea is we have two programs that are running on the same hardware. That means that they share some common state. I don't know if the term cache is going to need explanation, but whatever. There's different pieces of memory that they have access to, and so this attacking software needs to take turns with the software that we're trying to protect, or it it basically has to take turns. They try to access this piece of memory, and if the target software is busy using that piece of memory, the attacker has to wait. And now they've learned something. Oh, I have to wait to do this. Or they can try to access a piece of memory, and if it's really quick, they know that the processor has recently accessed that memory, and so it's has it basically near at hand. And so they know, okay, this attacked software, this is the target software that we're attacking, that must have recently touch this piece of memory.
Wait, can I interject? So when you first started talking about them both accessing the same memory, I first started thinking about things like one program trying to jam the other somehow. But you actually what you explained a moment ago actually went in a different direction, which seemed to be more like the malicious program is trying to learn something about the other program. And so, but I'm trying to like now reconcile that with kind of the goal of, okay, ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to ensure that a particular execution is happening as we would
Right.
expect it to happen. So like, why do I care if, you talked about like open source code that is the program that is being run. And the point is just, we want to be sure this open source code is being run. So can you like at a high level, give me a sense of why does it matter if everybody learns what is happening?
Very good. So, okay. So in our, many tangents, I sort of forgot to make the main point, which is that there's two kinds of properties that you could want from a TEE. One is integrity, meaning that the computation happens as stipulated by the program, or it doesn't happen at all. And you have to say, or it doesn't happen at all, because obviously someone can just unplug this thing, But if there's an output, it should be correct according to the logic stipulated in the code. The other property, which is the more interesting property, but also the harder one to achieve, is confidentiality, meaning that some adversary, which, will depend on your security model, will not learn about the data being processed by the program or about the program itself, depending on what property you're after. And so the attacks that I mentioned, the software attacks, were going after the confidentiality property. You can go after integrity as well, but that's much harder to do in software, because we can get into sort of why the systems look the way they look, but basically a lot of this is security retrofitted into just normal chips, and normal chips, server grade chips, have been optimized for speed and performance and accuracy. And so they are very used to making sure that programs run correctly. And even though we have a lot of different software going very quickly, we make sure the output is correct. They haven't spent time optimizing for confidentiality. And that's why that's partly a much harder property to achieve. It's also just harder because it's a more complex property.
Sure, but okay, but I'm just trying to think about I don't want to get too far into the sort of eventual applications we're going to be thinking about, but obviously at some point we're going to talk about applications in blockchain, and I'm just trying to think about like how much the confidentiality requirement matters for those particular applications. So first of all, so it sounds like, even the way you frame it, it's not about learning what the execution is, more like probably learning what the user input into the execution. Maybe that thing is really sensitive, right? I mean, I guess it depends on the application. Maybe it is the code that itself, but my point is, like, I could see much more where a situation that I don't want whatever the user is providing as an input to be leaked. But I guess I'm also trying to think about, and so if this is too much of a tangent, then maybe let's just set it aside. But I'll ask it anyway, which is that in the space of, let's call it, relevant applications, and then for the one, let's say in blockchain, is the confidentiality requirement actually that important?
Yeah, I would say the confidentiality requirement is, or the confidentiality property is by far the most interesting one.
No, you said interesting. That's not the same thing as saying practically important.
Practically important.
Okay.
Yes, certainly. And we can get to use cases, and I would say that even in the use cases where we only care about the integrity property, usually we're relying on some other mechanism to give us the confidentiality. So we'll say, okay, the TE gives us integrity, but we're also going to run this like fancy MPC interactive cryptography program to give us confidentiality. And the TE is just making sure that every node is following the rules. And then you still kind of end up with the overhead of achieving confidentiality for that use case. And let's get back to that. I just want to finish the intro explanation. So, okay, so software adversaries. Someone through some mechanism ends up running malicious software next to the program we're trying to protect, and they learn about that program. And how hard it is to do that depends partly on the TE design, and it depends partly on how poorly the program that is being attacked is written. There is such a thing as like writing a secure program. If the same way like that you can write a vulnerability into a program, you can that can be like directly exploited by someone just like saying transfer me all the money to a broken smart contract. You can also write a program that's easily exploitable through these software side channels, right? That's the term, side channels. But then in the physical attack side of things, there's a bunch of other things you have to worry about. So even if we don't have some malicious software that can learn about the logic that's being attacked, there's a bunch of other things that a physical attacker can do. They can, there's actually a very large field of research that studies like power side channels. So they look at the power being consumed by the chip, and it turns out that that power will depend very in a very statistically relevant or like a significant way on the data that's being processed. And so you can look at a chip doing a signature algorithm or encrypting or using some kind of a private key, and just by looking at the power traces, you can learn what that private key is. And so you can design the chip to make that not the case, or even design the software to make that much harder to do. But that's one of the kind of attacks that people can do. They can come and inject faults, so they can, depending on the sort of sophistication and the capital available, they can take some kind of a machine with some degree of precision that injects a pulse, a electromagnetic pulse or a laser pulse that flips a bit in several wires or in some like pieces of memory, and now the chip it might execute the wrong program. The most advanced or like the hardest attacks to deal with, or in some sense, in some sense they're the hardest, because if you have physical access to the point where you can like really get inside the chip, you can do all the other things as well. You can like just listen to it and do software attacks. But the hardest attacks to deal with are invasive attacks. So these are attacks where the adversary comes and says, look, like, from the outside, I can't get into it, but I know in there's a private key. I'm just going to drill into this thing, shave away at it, whatever, until I can see this private key. And obviously you can design it so that that's not the case. Or you can design it so it's hard to see the private key, or what I think is the better approach, and what the more security-oriented, secure hardware, like hardware wallets and these kind of things do, is they build self-destruct tripwires, basically, or self-destruct in some other means, so that if the adversary is trying to change the physical structure of the chip, the key goes poof. And now anyone who's remotely interacting with this thing is safe, because the key that's supposed to decrypt the data they're sending doesn't exist anymore. The adversary can't get it out. So that's kind of one of the countermeasures. Anyway, so just taking a step back, we have this hierarchy of attackers, basically. You have attackers who don't have physical access to the chip. They can just run software next to the target program, and depending on how you design the chip, that may be a feasible attack or not. Then you have attackers who have like physical access to the chip, but maybe they don't have the capacity to break into it. They don't have the tools, or for whatever reason, we assume that they're not going to break the physical structure of the chip. They can just listen to it. And then we have the most powerful adversaries who can, take apart the chip physically, and then also obviously do the other things. If you can drill into it, you can listen to it, you can run software on it. And different TEs give us guarantees against different attackers. Almost all of the TEs that you find on the market today, the Intel SGX or TDX or AMD ACV, these are kind of names you'd hear, they only try to protect you against software attacks. Right? So this thing is supposed to be running in the cloud, and you're comfortable with GCP or Azure or whoever it is, and based on that you feel that it's secure. And even there's like a lot of haziness on what security you actually get, but that's kind of what these things are designed for. There exists other hardware, like hardware wallets I mentioned, chips in your credit card, etc., that are built to resist adversaries with full invasive control. ATMs are another example. And so anyway, that is the ramble. Yeah.
No, that was very good. Yeah. But so just on the last part about, like you said, there are chips that are built to deal with, let's say, full invasive control, I think is how you phrase it. But there must be some security assumptions, right? So I'm just thinking of an analogy to, let's say, the distributed systems literature, where I'm more familiar with what security means. there aren't results that under any circumstance, under any sort of network model, and irrespective of the number of Byzantine faults, that we always get safety and liveness, for instance. So I'm guessing even here there must be some typical assumptions from which then you derive a positive result.
Yes. So in the software case, people prove security against any software adversary. That's like it's not, those security mechanisms are not what's implemented in modern chips. To some degree, we don't know because it's all like opaque and closed. But there are, you can, say, I have built this microarchitecture, I've built this chip so that the software that's being protected isn't vulnerable to other software if it's used in a particular way, But when you get to the physical side of things, okay, now you have to kind of like model the adversary and the capabilities. And if you look at the like non-invasive literature, typically they'll have some assumption like the adversary can only inject this many faults, or they can only inject faults with this level of precision, which is the more accurate model, I think. And there's debate around what the right model is. And so they'll create a proof that says, assuming the adversary can only inject faults with this kind of precision, the program with like negligible probability, only with negligible probability will do something incorrect, and otherwise will behave correctly. And so that's a secure program. And with side channels,
wait, hold on. So the framing already there suggests that the attacker has to be somehow bounded in terms of what the attacker can do. So, okay, assuming that is the case, it's not clear that's the case based on your initial reaction.
Yeah.
But assuming that is the case, then I guess I'm trying to just think about, like, practically speaking. Okay, so I'll give you an analogy to distributed systems literature where I can speak very coherently, and then maybe you'll see where I'm going. So basically what I'm saying is when computer scientists tell me, I can't tolerate more than 1/3 Byzantine faults, my reaction as an economist is, well, why do you think that somebody wouldn't, put up the capital in order to be 50% of the nodes in the network?
Yes.
And so by the same token, whatever threshold whatever limitations you are putting on the attacker, I guess, is the basis for this that, like, given the current state of technology, it would be literally impossible to do it. Like now here I'm thinking about things like, breaking a collision resistant hash function or something like, if you use all computational power in the entire world right now, it would take you the time that the Earth has existed in order to do this. So what exactly where does the practical context for the limitations that are imposed on the attacker in these models come from, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Okay, so that tees up the second part of my explanation quite well. So, like I said, we have these parameters, like the number of faults, or in the power trace case, the number of traces the adversary can collect, like the number of runs of this program that they can see the power consumption of. And there's slight variations, but those are the base parameters. And then you can sort of scale up your security as long as the proofs hold to such a high parameter that it's not practical. So you could say, hey, the adversary only needs to can't do it in less than 10 traces. Well, 10 traces isn't much that they'll be able to do that. But if you say they can't do it, I think the highest that people really evaluate is 100 million traces. And this is like weeks of data that you're collecting, and it's also very hard to process. And it's okay, well, if you can't get it past this point, then practically we see we've achieved the security, and we have the proofs that say, usually the proofs will be about statistical moments and these kinds of things. But the point is you have these parameters, and you can, it's one of those things that is like, it's a little bit like some of the cryptographic assumptions where, like, it seems like, if in theory prove it to be secure in this way, in practice we can see that if someone tries for 100 million traces, they still aren't able to break it. So we think it's secure, but like, hey, we have assumptions in all of cryptography and security, and at the end of the day, we just have some confidence in those. Where the really hairy part of hardware security comes in is when it comes to invasive attacks. Because invasive attacks, I gave the example of someone.
Before you go to invasive, so let's take that 100 million. By the way, you do the 100 million thing.
You're about to ask me about costs, right, Fahad? The explanation I'm about to give will get your economist brain excited.
Okay, but well, let me first just pose the question. Yes, I am curious about the cost, but I was going to frame it in a slightly different way, which is that so then does everybody who produces a TEE just ensure that it is that you would need 100 million traces or whatever? I mean, the fact that we're using 100 million already kind of is suggestive of like, I think what you're alluding to, right? This reminds me of the thing like where people, like where certain computer scientists treat 10 to the negative 18 as though it's zero. So like, if the probability of something is sufficiently small, then, it's zero, whatever. But my point is that like, if there is a particular standard that everybody is kind of comfortable with, then does that mean that everybody who designs these things then, or most people who design it, they'd reach the standard, or is it really expensive to set up the system so that you would need then 100 million traces in order? That's the cost, right? Or is
it... So it depends on what hardware we're talking about. If we're talking about TEs as they are like sold off the shelf today, no, that is like, they firstly don't try to really give any defense against physical attackers, and typically don't accompany their security measures with like rigorous proofs against very complex adversaries. It's like there was a bug, there was a vulnerability, and we patched it.
Sounds a bit like parts of the blockchain community.
But there are other forms of hardware where that was a good comment. But there are other parts of the secure hardware ecosystem where they do have take a YubiKey, for example. They will implement first order masking and say, look, we've proven this is a first order secure masking scheme, which should give us security up to based on evaluations, this many traces, or usually they'll evaluate it up to for something like a YubiKey to 100 million and they couldn't find anything. And so the proofs say it's secure. Practically, it looks like they implemented something which matches the proofs. And so it's dandy,
Okay, wait. So just one last follow up before we get into the invasive side, which is So okay, because you made an allusion to something that did make me think of something in blockchain. I won't reference specific context here just for the sake of it, but for instance, let's just say there are a lot of L1 blockchains that are deployed without a formal verification that the protocol assures safety and liveness under any circumstances. There's no formal sort of thing that's laid out. And so I guess part of what I was thinking about is like, well, in this context, I was kind of saying like, well, why? Like, what is the constraint to doing that? And in my head, what I was thinking about is like, maybe it's hard to come up with the sort of the technology to achieve that standard.
No.
But actually, now that I think about the blockchain context, which you made me sort of think about, I think actually that's not usually the pain point in that context. It's usually something like just for instance, if you're not an academic to begin with, then you don't necessarily think about like formal guarantees in the same way, and you more have a builder mentality of like, look, we'll create it, we're pretty sure it works. You find out if there's a problem in it, and we'll patch it if there is a problem in it. Is it more of like a cultural thing that? Yeah, who cares about the formal guarantees? Like you try to take this thing down, it won't work, I promise. Or is it actually that there is? Or maybe in some sense, part of it is like an intellectual hurdle, if you like the extra thinking that goes into like showing that this thing that I have here actually achieves those guarantees is just kind of not worth it for me for some reason.
So I wasn't there at the inception of SGX, of the first, like cloud TEE, or at the time it wasn't even a cloud TEE, but like people think of that sort of first Intel SGX as sort of the start of this family of secure hardware. But I think I have some explanations that certainly hold true today. So a couple of weeks ago, we saw some papers coming out going to CCS, academic conference, exploiting TEEs. And it was a physical attack. So it in some sense isn't an exploit because they never said we're trying to protect against physical attacks. But the point is still they, broke the machines. And the reason they were able to do that is because a couple of years ago, there was an upgrade, a new generation of TEs was produced, and they just took out the defenses against that specific attack. And the reason they took it out is because the demand from, the biggest users at the time was for more performance. They're like, it was, I refer to these like GDPR tick box use cases, and I don't have Intel's data from them. I don't know exactly what the biggest use cases are, but there are definitely a set of use cases where they say, hey, like we're using TEs that like add some security, but we don't want to pay 30% overhead. We don't want to pay 7% overhead, or 7% is what it is today. We don't want to pay 30%. And so to hell with that, we already like trust Azure. We, the big Web 2 GDPR tick box use case, we trust Azure anyway for a bunch of other infrastructure. And so we're kind of okay, assuming that they have like physical access and may be able to break it. We just want some level of security and no overhead. And so basically, that's one of the biggest incentives that's given us the kind of machines we see today. People responding, these big chip manufacturers responding to these incentives. I think the other thing is that it's very expensive to engineer architectures from the ground up. And if you speak to security people, they'll tell you need to, if you want to build a secure system, you have to have security in mind from day one. And what's happened with these systems is that last year's generation wasn't built with security in mind, but it's very expensive to do something from scratch. And so let's take what we had there and then layer on some security countermeasures, take on some things which were clearly very bad. But they're not like willing to invest to build something from the ground up because they're like also, not confident that, at least until recently, that there's like much demand for it. There is a knowledge component to it as well. Like when, in 2013, the state of knowledge, especially, there's a gap in communities, right? The people who work on like, the chips in your bank card are academics in Europe and like certification bodies in Europe who, think about these kind of physical attacks. The people who are designing SGX originally, to my knowledge, were not as clued up to that. They didn't think that these kinds of attacks would be something you can pull off on a big, powerful machine, which we learned is not the case. And like a lot of the attacks that happen even via software, people didn't think were possible then, because they hadn't really stated this goal of like, hey, can you attack this thing? And so the state of knowledge is also just advanced while it's hard to change the architectures. And so now we see this big gap where there's a bunch of, academic knowledge and knowledge that's applied to like very specific parts of the industry that hasn't made it to commercial TEs because, I guess, of these historical factors and economic incentives. Yeah. But just to finish my explanation from earlier.
Which one?
Popping up, yeah. So I explained the adversarial models for non-invasive attacks, right? So then here's where it gets messy. Is in invasive attacks, most of the time people say, hey, we'll give you security against an adversary who has, these kinds of tools or this kind of budget. We'll say, if they have less than 250K, then we don't think they'll be able to do it. Then they shouldn't be able to break into it. They don't give you this kind of overall, unconditional security. And I think there is one important thing to consider here is that if you're testing a security assumption in software or even a mathematical security assumption, the ability to iterate on that is much, much greater than with a physical object. Like if you want to iterate on a security assumption, on a, you say learning with errors is hard, or I'm not whatever. AES is hard to break. Some guy can just immediately hop on his computer or sit with his notepad and start trying to break that. With hardware, one, you need to pay to produce the objects, and then that takes some time, and then you have iteration cycles. But really, the biggest issue is that it's this like heavily NDA'd industry. So if you're a researcher and you want to break these kind of security primitives, you might get sued. or you may not be able to publish it, or there's a lot of friction to it. A lot of these attacks that people pull off on hardware, it takes them 90% of the time is spent reverse engineering. Like, what actually is this object? What are the security primitives? How are they implemented? Where are the wires? And once you have that figured out, it takes them a couple of days, and then they pull off the attack. And so I think because the hardware industry hasn't allowed people to iterate on these physical security assumptions much, especially in the non-invasive stuff, the logical design is relatively important. People have been able to iterate on that, but physical design, you just need to produce it, and that ends up being very heavily protected, and people haven't been able to iterate on that. And so our confidence, or our ability to be confident in these primitives isn't very high, and we haven't been able to iterate to like very heavily secure primitives, or as secure as we could be. I think the efficient frontier is very far away from where we are, and thankfully there's a lot of open hardware developments happening at the moment. So I think there's more people looking at it. Like Raspberry Pi had a bug bounty. It wasn't open hardware, but they created a legal gap where they said, "Hey guys, we have a bug bounty. Please attack our hardware," which is a change from how it usually happens. And then this company IOActive went and said, "Sure, we'll have a look at it." And then the physically secure key storage they had on there, they broke. Again, it was a story where they took 2 weeks to reverse engineer it, and then a day or a couple of days to get the data out. Anyway, so that's a very long ramble, but
no, that was
the hairy part. Yeah,
that was really good, but I have questions.
Great.
Okay, so I'm just trying to understand the piece that you said there about how the NDA aspect, that there's sort of information that people don't know, and if they actually knew the information, then it only takes a couple of days to basically do one of these invasive attacks. So are you basically saying that if somebody with the proper engineering skills wanted to completely reconstitute a state-of-the-art TEE tomorrow, the primary reason why they wouldn't be able to is because they kind of literally don't understand, they literally don't know the sort of proprietary information about how that TE is physically put together?
If you wanted to attack it, that would be the... Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I was like, can I just buy a TE and then take it apart and okay, now I know what the hardware is like, and then I can attack other ones? There's some, maybe the NDA is what's stopping me. What's happening?
The NDA is stopping you from making that public a lot of the time, and so the reverse engineering is actually very.
Right?
Sorry?
I want to attack.
Yeah. You can do it, but usually the reverse engineering, it's not as simple as sitting there with the little screwdriver taking things apart. Like, if you really want to get down to the physical details, we're talking about things at the size of nanometers. So it takes a lot of expensive equipment. You need a scanning electron microscope. You need a very fine delayering process that I said nanometers. I think at the level of microns, you want to be sort of shaving off layers, taking photos of the chips. So you have a really good understanding of what's going on there. You don't always need that level of detail. Depends on the kind of attack. Like if you're just pulling off an attack that operates on the logical functionality, maybe you just need to be able to observe all the accesses to memory, but it just takes time.
Right, but so that's what I was trying to get to. So the way I'm thinking about it now, so I want to just see if this is the right way, if you think this is a reasonable way to think about it. So there's sort of the math and the CS that goes into this, and then there's more, let's say, the electrical engineering and the physics that goes into this.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so the way I see what you're saying is the math and the CS, that's well, okay. I guess what you're saying in terms of the intellectual challenge of doing an invasive hardware attack actually isn't that high. It's just they literally don't know what the sort of electrical engineering and physics side looks like. And to your response to Brad seemed to be yes, you could physically buy a TE, but the thing is it's not that easy to infer, even when you have the physical object, how the sort of the physical object was put together. But if you were to know how that was done, for instance, if the company that produced it said, look, here's the documents, this is exactly how it was put together, then you would very easily be able to do an invasive hardware attack.
Yes. yes, or obviously I can't say that it would be very easy to pull off an attack on a specific piece of hardware should you have the right information, but that is I think quite a reasonable assumption to have. And we have some high level knowledge of how keys in SGX are stored, for example. And so it seems quite reasonable that someone should be able to extract them given enough resources, which is always a claim. I think my very ideological side thinks but idealistic side maybe is we could probably get to a point where we say, hey, we have this hardware, we've made it very easy to break it, no one's broken it, just like AES, and so maybe someone will break it eventually, but we can get to we can try to hypothesize unconditional security. But that's very idealistic. The practical thing to go for and to reason about in the near future and certainly in present time is having some dollar cost, because there are just expensive machines, and if you can force someone to use at least 50 human hours, at least 100 human hours to read out some information from a chip, then they you can assign some dollar cost to that. But I should say I think the closed source aspect and the need to reverse engineer things is a very large part of why we haven't seen nearly as much scientific rigor on breaking these countermeasures, these physical security countermeasures. But they are also just practical challenges. It takes time to reverse engineer to shave down a chip. It takes time to prepare a sample, and then if you break it, the defender has to go and produce a new one, and that takes months, if not years, as well. So there are just natural barriers, but I think those can be a lot of those can be overcome if we say, hey, we're gonna really try to iterate on the physical security. We're gonna give the attackers all of the advantage we could possibly give them all of the information, give them many different chips so they can try and destroy a bunch before they try a legitimate attack, and that'll really speed up the iteration cycle.
I do want to probe you more on this hardware stuff, because I know that's exactly what you've been spending a year working on. But I think we should switch to BuilderNet for a bit first.
Yes.
Because this is how it's been. I would say one way it's been having an impact in the crypto space. So maybe just I'll hand it off to you. Explain what is BuilderNet, and this is a Flashbots project, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
It's a protocol that's being developed by Flashbots, but there's multiple parties involved.
Okay.
So before I start this explanation, I should probably cap off all of what I've said before, which sounds very doom and gloom. I'm describing the security assumptions and how they break, and the ways in which the security assumptions are not great. You might come off of that thinking why on earth is anyone using this?
I did feel a little skeptical with the hardware attack. I was like,
yeah. So I think there's two things to say. One is, practically today, using TEs does give you a lot of security in the sense that it's running in the cloud. I don't have physical access to it. Yes, Azure has physical access to it. If you're worried about Microsoft coming after you, that is something you have to be aware of, or Intel. But I would find it very difficult to break into it. I don't know if I would succeed. And I don't think if Flashbots tried to break into a TE, would be able to do it. But maybe some specialist researcher will come up with something in a couple of years.
Wait. Can I ask you something you said there triggered a question in me. What is the upside of anybody attacking any particular TE on the planet right now? So this reminds me a little bit of people saying, Bitcoin is super secure because it hasn't had a major attack ever in whatever its 15 plus year life. I'm like, well, when there was basically Satoshi in his basement mining on Bitcoin and nobody else, what was the upside of somebody doing a double spending attack on the Bitcoin blockchain? It's clearly pretty obvious that it wasn't that secure in 2009, but nobody cared. And so by the same token, in this context, what is the economic value to anybody to run an attack on a TE? Practically, I mean.
I don't think it's that large. Probably, I'm not. I'll tell you why it's a hard question to answer, because a lot of the stuff that people can gain from it will be like data. Okay, someone says they're running like confidential AI inference. Now it's not confidential, but it's hard to put a dollar sign on the data. But and most people today know that TEEs are not very secure, so they don't run things in there that are, they're not putting a private key holding $1 billion of Bitcoin in a TEE.
But then it becomes hard to sort of say like, well, we don't know of any major attacks to date or something. Not that there aren't any, but my point is like, to the extent that any TEs have not been attacked, in some sense, it's like a very conservative way of looking at the security of it.
Yeah. To be clear, TEs have been attacked a bunch.
No, I know.
And usually that comes from academic
Yeah.
incentives. Yeah.
Yeah.
But your point is valid, and I think basically what you need to do is put a honeypot in there and say, we are using the system, and we posit that there is like some amount of security in the system, and so we'll put a private key that has some amount of value on it, and say, here is a $500,000 incentive to break a particular TE, or like any TE. Maybe we issue many of them with this key, and if no one breaks it, then we feel more comfortable. But
Satoshi should put his private key into a TE and see what kind of bounty that leads to.
Yeah.
But
okay. I would imagine that it would be, people would be going after that for sure. But okay,
yes,
but just to finish the point, so at present day, I think it makes sense to use TEs for two reasons. One is because it does give you practical security. And the second is that you can design systems to leverage the benefits of TEs without very heavily relying on them, right? So you can, build systems in where you rotate between different TEs, where if there's some private key that's very valuable, you share it between many different TEs from different vendors, or like just having some broader MPC protocol. And like the MEV use cases the Flashbots are interested in, usually you need to keep data private for a couple of seconds at most. And so, that protects you from some different kinds of attacks. So there's definitely a lot of nuance in how you can use it, and it's certainly better than nothing today. In the long run, and this is what I think people get wrong, in the long run, there's actually a lot of room to improve on the state of TEs. Like, basically what I was saying, earlier, was that the market incentives haven't been there for someone to go and apply rigorous security techniques and take some performance trade-offs. And that's actually something I've been working on. I've been coordinating this effort with, researchers and like a hardware company, and we're trying to produce a new TEE, open source and sort of philanthropically funded. But I think there's definitely an incentive for that, and if we treat it like we treat other primitives, and we say, look, FHE is 7 orders of magnitude too slow today, but if we put our backs into it, maybe we can get there. I think that's sort of this. If we had a similar attitude with hardware, we'd get to a much better position. Anyway, yeah. I'm sorry, I went back to hardware. so are you, Brad? We'll get to BuilderNet eventually.
I wanted to add something to Fahad's thing. Is like with your question about like incentive to break the TEs, that I think this part of the what did you call it? This is a very basic word, like hiding the data that you're sending into the TE. And if you're ordering transactions, for example, and you're trusting that people can't see your transactions, but if you're able to break that, then you can basically front run and sandwich and things like that. So I think that's one, when you start doing more and more economic activity on the Ts, then keeping the data private. Or basically having access to that private data becomes more valuable, and then it makes sense to try and break it. But
yes, that's definitely true. I think that there's a distinction also between detectable and undetectable breaks, and you want to design your system so that someone breaks the hardware and is therefore able to extract money. That extraction is detectable, and then okay, we need to respond to something. I think the worst case scenario is a system where you don't rotate the machines. It's very clear which machine is doing what, and if someone breaks it, you wouldn't know that they've broken it for a long time. And I think to your point, like having some key with a bunch of money on there is like a really good model. There's some like academic work called like the Sting framework on how to structure these kind of like bounties well and to try to detect if a system is broken.
But yeah, maybe that's a good transition into BuilderNet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So okay,
so you're saying it's a protocol.
Yes, BuilderNet. What is BuilderNet? How does it relate to everything we've been talking about? Basically, BuilderNet is a continuation of what Flashbots has been doing since its inception, which is dealing with MEV in people trying to access blockchains and needing to pass through several intermediaries with some influence over the economic outcomes that they're trying to realize on the blockchain. And at first, we had MEV Geth, where Flashbots was like created the service where basically Flashbots was monitoring the miners back then, not the validators, and making sure that they were sort of following some broad set of rules and not doing whatever they wanted. But this was a very sort of reputation-based system, and it's hard to do that when there are very large mining pools in the system. And so we moved on to PBS, and there's a lot of discussion on PBS. We can get there if you want. But basically, the evolution there was that now instead of the sort of core consensus participants, of which there are many and whose identities are unknown, some of them at least, doing a lot of this like, very sensitive work where they're ordering transactions and choosing inclusion. We have shifted that to an external market where now the validator, the consensus participant, is untrusted, and there is this external market where the blocks are coming from. Flashbots ran a block builder, other block builders popped up, and that's kind of been the market that we've been with since the merge.
However, this is Mev Boost that you're talking about, right?
This is Mev Boost.
Right.
Now in recent months, I should know the number, but let's say the last 6 months, if not more, we've set up BuilderNet, and BuilderNet basically says, okay, well, look, we have this market, we have this setup now where we don't have to trust the validator set. And in some sense now we can, leave the Ethereum validator set at peace, and we don't have to like impose these very complex incentives on them. We have this builder market, but the builder market itself has issues. It's still the end user needs to pass through these block builders to get to the chain. These block builders are trusted. And they have the ability to front run and these kind of things. It's a bit better than before with the validators because block builders are sort of operate in every slot, and so there's like a lasting reputation. And if they behave very poorly, then maybe users will decide not to share their order flow or their transactions with that block builder. But still, it's not ideal from a trust perspective. It's also not ideal in that we have a very centralized kind of system where up until the launch of BuilderNet, there was only a handful of block builders, and of course, it's a more nuanced argument in that new block builders can pop up, but basically they have a lot of influence over the system. If if one block builder producing half of the blocks in the network, if it doesn't cost them too much, they can choose to exclude particular kinds of transactions from half of the Ethereum blocks, which maybe we don't want, and they have this sort of like advantageous position in the network where because they're running the block builder that produces 50% of the blocks, can prioritize their own trades, and so the neutrality that the Ethereum network is after is sort of eroded by the privileged position of these block builders. So what BuilderNet is a effort to take this like block builder role, but improve the sort of trust assumptions that the user has to make, and to distribute the control over the system across many actors and across multiple geographies. And the geographies thing is important because it is a challenge to make sure that we have diversity of regulatory regimes, for example, influencing the block production process, because it feels like we should at least match or try to match the Ethereum's broad neutrality in the block building world. So concretely today, what BuilderNet is 3 operators. It's Flashbots, it's Nethermind and Beaver Builder, who used to, I think they're still technically running the centralized builder, but they used to only be doing that now. They're mostly participating in BuilderNet, running TE-based nodes that are producing blocks. What's important about the system is not just that they're running this TE infrastructure, which gives end users better assurances. And really, at the moment, it's also a way for Flashbots to incorporate, extend our brand to these other parties that we don't necessarily, they're a different entity. Because they're running TEs, we're able to trust them better. So, okay, we're going to operate all together. But it's not just about the infrastructure, it's also about the economic aspects of the protocol. So one of the factors that we've seen influence concentrate the builder market in the past was sort of these order flow dynamics, where it turns out there were sort of almost like network effects to having more and more transactions seen exclusively by one builder. And in order to combat this, we're working on different protocols to distribute this information between the different block builders who are participating. Yeah, I would say that's a good high level description, and there's a longer term vision that I can get into, but that's up to today.
Oh, I have two basic questions. You said that using T's for the block building gives these users like extra assurances. I don't know if I'm quoting you directly, but I'm not sure who the users are. Like, are you talking about me trying to submit a transaction? Like, yeah, who are the users that you're talking about in this case?
Yeah, I kind of don't imagine that you would go on the, whatever the GitHub or website and go check the attestations and see if it all makes sense.
But it still impacts me as who is it impacting? Did it really change my life? I mean, using the blockchain.
I think the
swapping.
I think you're using MetaMask or the Uniswap wallet or whatever, and ultimately there's usually some default RPC there, and whoever controls what that is, I think it's an important consideration for them. But the most interesting actors in the MEV space always is the sort of the searchers or traders or whatever term you want to use, people who are sort of more actively and in a more sophisticated way engaging with the blockchain and the financial primitives built on it, because they are thinking about these decisions way more and are sort of up to lose more for bad decisions and make more for good decisions, and I think they care about this a bit more. Like if you rewind a couple months back, you see examples of for example, we'd have these block builders who were also running their own trading strategies, arbitraging, between Binance and Uniswap. And if there was another trading team that was doing the same thing, they wouldn't send their trades through that block builder because they didn't trust them to treat their trades on an equal footing and expected there to be some adverse selection, and so they stayed away from it. And if we're able to give these guarantees that we're not misbehaving, that benefits that allows these trading firms to send their trades to these block builders without having to worry about it so much, and they can also sort of avoid having to spend so much time monitoring. I think also at the same time, probably it's not as pressing at the moment, but it is a benefit of the system. The people who run the infrastructure themselves benefit from having sort of the plausible deniability, or maybe that's the wrong term, but the ability to say, look, I can prove to you that I didn't misbehave. I received these transactions in a certain way and I didn't intentionally or I didn't at all, cause this what looks like a front run or what looks like a sandwich or something like that. So it helps people to also not have to play this reputation game, because a lot of the block builders were getting tired of this, where they sort of had to go and campaign and say, hey, like we'll treat your trades really well. Please send your trades to us. And this is much easier for them.
Yeah. Okay, actually, this partly answers my second question, because without calling any names, we know that these block builders are integrated, right? Like they're doing the searching, and as you're sending it to them, it's one one integration. So if I'm controlling the whole stack, what is the incentive for me to take part in BuilderNet? Because I don't want to share my order flow. It's like, send it to me. I'm going to send it to myself. My searchers should send it to me because I'll build the blocks. I don't want to share my order flow. And who cares if people make a campaign against me? Because I'm making more money this way. Right?
Yeah.
So I think there's me at Uniswap, but in general.
Yes. I think there's two reasons. And I wasn't. It's not. My job isn't to interface with these guys.
I'm just trying to understand incentive.
But there's two high level incentives. One is people care. People want to realize. I think it's caring that they want to realize this decentralized world, and they prefer to have that than running centralized infrastructure. But they also care in the sense that they know if this doesn't end up realizing some of the properties that we care about and doesn't end up being decentralized in some way, we end up maybe not growing the pie as much. And if if you have 20%, if you take a couple of basis points of profit for either the volume on-chain exchanges, you'd love to see that volume grow. And the other incentive is if you're primarily a trading firm and most of your value generated is coming from trading, then having to run a block builder and compete for all of this other order flow and convince people who are doing other kinds of trades, who are sending just user transactions, doing all these kind of things, to keep sending this stuff to you and to service them as customers almost, and to convince them to send stuff to you, and then have to deal with the sort of backlash and regulatory concerns and all of that. That's like often not what they want to do. They just want to trade. And so if you can provide a system where they have still pretty good control and access and all of the features that they care about in their own stacks, but they don't have to worry about that, and maybe you're able to muster more value from other order flow, then it makes sense for them to participate. And so I think those are the two sort of high level explanations.
So I have some mechanical questions on this. So we spent a bunch of time talking obviously about TEs and how essentially there's a physical object, right?
Yeah.
And we also talked about how you're running programs on them. And you made mention to Flashbots, Beaver, and Nethermind. And so I guess my first question is like, how many physical TEs is within like the scope of BuilderNet? Yeah, let me just leave it there.
It's not 3. It's more than 3.
Okay.
That was in my head, 3.
Yeah, because these are the operators, but there's also redundancy and distribution of different nodes. I don't know the answer to your question. I think my answer is like more than 3, less than 50. That's
okay, so all of those pieces of hardware have different private keys, right?
Yes.
Okay. But presumably they're all running the same software, which is why we consider all of them part of BuilderNet, like the same program that we're talking about here? Or
yeah, at the moment it's a I don't know if it's exactly the same, but they're very close to being the same across the different operators. I think in future we're relatively excited about having more of a free market approach and leaving things customizable to people without compromising overall security. But at the moment, it's relatively homogeneous.
But so every so to be clear, every instance, let's say, BuilderNet corresponds to a private key on a piece of hardware, which is a TE, which has another private key. So basically, some people might in their mind have an idea of like one application that is being run in some there's one TE at Area 51, and that's the one that is running everything. So that's clearly not the case. And it's not one program and one piece of hardware. As you said, maybe there's like 50 or something, no more than 50.
50 is a strong a high upper bound. I think it's probably less than 50.
But part of the point I'm making is like, okay, so there's like this weird thing where people think about TEs as highly centralized, and I guess one piece of hardware is highly centralized because it's just one piece of hardware. But BuilderNet is not one TE sitting somewhere. As you said, it's a bunch of different TEs. Each of them are actually running, well, I don't want to say they're running different programs because, as you said, in some cases they might be running exactly the same source code. In some cases, it might be like different implementations of similar logic, but they all are identified by different private keys that these TEs have generated. These different TEs have generated for each of the programs.
Yes.
Okay. So, but then maybe could we get into the sort of logic of the software that they are supposed to be implementing? Like, what exactly am I assured of? Let's assume integrity of, in the sense you say, let's assume integrity of these programs. What are we actually assured of from a TE running BuilderNet?
So actually, integrity is insufficient because even if even if you have this block building algorithm that whatever orders transactions by priority fees, if the adversary can still learn what the different transactions are and what the priority fees are, they can just insert another transaction through the normal input channel that targets a specific position in the block and tries to front run someone.
Okay.
So it's
Actually,
privacy.
I was confidentiality.
Confidentiality.
I was going to ask about in this application how important is confidentiality, and you started to, and you gave well, we can dig into it, but you gave up an answer already that actually clarifies that quite a bit. But still, before we get there, what I'm really asking is, what is the logic of the source code that these things are supposed to be implementing? So you just alluded to like ordering by I guess priority fee. Is that what it is? Like,
no,
does it?
No.
Okay.
Okay, so before I answer this, I have to now insert the caveat that I am in the research team, and I think about TEs. I think about TEs like in 5 years from now. So I don't have the exact answer to your question. I haven't kept up with the latest updates, but to my understanding, they're running like a builder, some builder logic that is under the RBuilder repo on the GitHub. So it's like it's not a priority ordering; it's a optimization algorithm that sort of is implemented in a relatively neutral way. So the flow.
What's it optimizing?
Usually, the value of the block
to give to the validator.
Yes, yeah. Subject to
it still needs to go through MEV boost.
Yes. Wait, hold on, wait. When you say value the block, I mean that's so the MEV boost bid.
Mm-hmm.
Like okay, so obviously like you can sum up the priority fees in the block. Yeah, okay, so because I always think about the bid as a discretionary thing, given that
yes,
which is separate from, for instance, the value of the block in the sense of the sum of the priority fees plus any transfers to the transaction fee recipient.
Let me break it up into like 3 high-level phases. The first is ingress simulation. These are engineering terms. I'm not exactly sure if ingress is the right term, but basically the bundles arrive, and we need to separate the wheat from the chaff, and so we simulate these transactions at the top of the block. Like we just say, like, if we put this at the top of the block, what would happen? Does it pay us anything? And by that, we have some estimate of whether this is valuable. Because we receive, like the Ethereum block contains a couple hundred transactions, we receive like orders of magnitude more because we give people these guarantees that, hey, if your transaction doesn't succeed, we won't include it. These are the traders who are receiving every couple of milliseconds the price on Binance moves, and so they update their trades, and so we see a lot more traffic, and we have to be able to filter through that and figure out where we spend our resources. So that's step 1. And that's highly parallelizable because you're only simulating against the top of the block. You can just spin up many clusters doing this. Now, the second step consists of like smaller substeps, but at a high level, you're now taking these and saying, okay, let's try different orders. We now have some information of what we pay at the top of the block. Let's try different orderings. And every time we find one that's better than the previous or it seems pretty good, we have to like compute a state root for it as well. So, which is just like a computational task. It takes optimized it quite heavily. So it's gone from whatever the 200 milliseconds it was. That's a made up number down to like 30 or 60 or something like that. And then the third step is to figure out how much, okay, it overlaps slightly with the previous step, but you have to figure out how much to bid in MEV Boost. And obviously that bid isn't the full block value. And
Right.
part of the reason it's not the full block value is because there's a mechanism which takes the revenue generated by the system and sends it back to people whose transactions were included in the block. So it's like decentralized also in the sense that the revenue capture is being shared with the sort of participants of the Ethereum ecosystem.
Okay. But okay, so a couple of questions. So first of all, so you're saying the actual bidding logic is part of BuilderNet? Because, because like in general, right, you could, in theory, as a builder who's not using BuilderNet, presumably, you could have two builders you could have two builders who are not using BuilderNet who form the exact same block but offer different bids. Like you could even somebody could bid higher than the entire block value.
Often.
Okay. Well. Okay. I won't digress there, but okay. Still, okay. So that's actually, but that's actually very clarifying. So the bid is actually even a part of the logic of what it's doing. And then you said also like this. Let's call it. Socializing of the gains of the block is apparently also part of the logic of it.
Yes.
And the first two pieces you were talking about really just did seem like maximizing the value of the block, but actually just one small clarification question on maximizing the value. So, okay, there's the priority fee. And so presumably that is part of what you're talking about as the value of the block, but that's not necessarily the only part, right? So for instance, you can have just transfers in like the normal way to whoever happens to be the fee recipient for the particular block, which is essentially the block builder. But is the sum of the priority fee plus transfer payments to the fee recipient what you mean by the block value?
Yes.
Okay. Then, so I guess my first question then beyond that is, so the socializing of the gains. How, like, can you, I'm sure okay, it's probably hard to give the exact logic, but like at a high level, and part of what I'm thinking about here is, for instance, like when you think about sandwich attacks, right? Like I'm guessing, because the first two steps you described seem like, they don't really protect against sandwich attacks. Although actually, hold on. So I guess there's another question. So the bundles, right? Like, obviously when you see these sort of sandwiches, they have this like flavor where, the meat of the sandwich doesn't have a particularly high priority fee or anything like that. It's just the victim. And it's usually actually the back run that seems to have like a very high, I haven't looked at this in a while, but maybe like a couple of years ago, I look at it, I would always see like a back run with a massive priority fee. The front run actually didn't necessarily have a very high priority fee. But so, yeah, could you like talk through how a sandwich attack works in this context, or if at all it is allowed to happen?
So I said we optimize for block value, but we do that within constraints, right? Because you want to, we don't want to be the ones who are sort of very opinionated and almost in a sense malicious. What we want to do is give like a sort of a neutral platform to people where everyone has this, no privileged information, including us. That's why we're using the TE. Right, and we process and go forward. And so the way it works is one of the basic guarantees we give is bundling, right? So a transaction executed on a blockchain is an atomic operation, right? It either happens or it doesn't. But transactions don't necessarily allow you to specify how they relate to other transactions. So a cluster of transactions is not atomic. And so we have implemented this from like the early days of MEV-Geth. There's this concept of a bundle, which allows someone to send a bunch of transactions and condition their inclusion on each other, and say, okay, the basic kind of guarantee.
Wait, just to clarify, the conditioning logic is not part of the smart contract code that is being running. It's like some external logic associated with interacting with your system. Okay.
Yeah, that's one of the interesting things about this like block building layer, and you see it Ethereum L1, the L2s, is that you can add in a bunch of logic that isn't inherent in the smart contract logic of the blockchain, which makes it easier to iterate with, and also means you can spend a lot more time doing these computations without consuming the resources of the overall network. And that's why we can process so many transactions and simulate them, because that cost isn't being passed on to the rest of the network. But if all of the transactions, even the ones that didn't succeed, ended up being passed on to the network, we'd only be able to deal with a couple hundred. Anyway, so how a sandwich attack works is, for some unfortunate reason, someone's transaction is sent to the public or sent to some malicious or whatever sandwiching actor, and this actor is like, sweet, I'm going to bundle this up into a sandwich, turn it into a bundle, and send this to a block builder. And then that will arrive as an atomic unit to the block building process, and will treat that like, single transactions are treated as bundles, multiple transactions are treated as bundles. Bundles is like the way that the sort of primary unit of the block building process. And it's like the same thing, simulated at the top of the block. You were saying the background transaction pays the priority fee. That will count as the priority fee for the whole thing. Yeah.
So you're basically saying that where it enters is in the sort of constraint to the first two steps that you were describing. And so you're saying when people send in things to the system, one of your constraints is that you have to respect the bundles that they sent in. So if they send it as a bundle, you have to put it on the block as a bundle or not at all.
Yes.
But okay, so then the natural question is, well, what about this poor victim? You talked about socializing the gains. Does this poor victim get something back? I guess it gets into that third step.
So the challenge with socializing gains, one of the challenges, as now we can get into some like game theory and mechanism design concepts, is like there is this information, or there's maybe some like objective sense in which the user being sandwiched is in a like, they're contributing more value to the system, and so that value should be attributed back to them. But the mechanism can only see some information, and you have to elicit that information in a way that isn't gameable. Because if you bias towards people who are being sandwiched, for example, say, we're going to treat them, we're going to give this middle transaction a disproportionate amount of the fees, or like maybe not disproportionate, but like some larger fraction than other transactions, then now you create an incentive for people to structure their bundles so it looks like someone's being sandwiched, but actually it's all their own trades or something like that. And so, also the problem that we're trying to solve, at least at first, is to get this decentralized block builder to a strong position in the market where actually it is building many blocks. And to do that, you have to compete with what the centralized block builders are doing. And the centralized block builders are offering what they call like refund deals. And so they'll say, send us transactions. They'll find some specific party who has valuable order flow and say, send your order flow exclusively to us, or maybe a slightly more complex agreement, but basically send exclusively to us. And then we will kick back the value we generate in our block building process according to some rules to you. And now this decentralized block builder is trying to build up market share. You need some sort of a mechanism that maybe isn't exactly the same, but achieves parity in some sense with those centralized refund deals. And so if you start optimizing for things other than, if you start rewarding people for things other than increasing the block value, you're no longer really solving that problem. I think that's why it doesn't work in the way you suggested at the moment.
How does this the example you brought up just now is actually perfect, because with MEV-Boost, it's the validator takes the one with the highest value going to the validator wins, right? The highest bid. And it seems like this socializing of value of the block is taking away value that would go to the validator. So if I had if I were not using BuilderNet, I can pay, and going directly to MEV-Boost, I could win every time. Assuming I can build equally as good. Actually, yeah. I'm just curious. It seems like unstable.
I think it is a hard economic problem to solve, doing this value attribution and like taking things to the limit. There definitely are some questions that need to be answered. But I think the notion that these refunds are directly competitive with the proposer in some way that is new, I don't think is accurate, because the attribution of value is done only for the value that remains after the MEV boost bid is given. So basically, we're socializing that which would have been the block builder's revenue, right? So it's not value that would have gone to the proposer at all. It's like the proposer got their bid, they got their payment, and then what's left used to go to centralized block build operator. Now a big chunk of that goes to people who sent in transaction.
Wait, hold on. But okay, so for instance, before Beaver was doing BuilderNet, they had discretion as to set their bid. Like, so basically, it sounds like you're sort of relating the current logic in BuilderNet in setting up in determining the bid with the pre-bidding logic. And so I guess I don't quite understand that. Like, does my question make sense?
Partially. Let me restate, an explanation, and then you tell me if it clarified what you're wondering about. So the process proceeds as usual in the block building flow. Block builder builds a block. It looks at the existing bids at the relays, looks at the value of the block, figures out how much it wants to bid, and puts that forward to the relay. And then after that, it's like maybe, ideally it's captured some revenue. It hasn't bid up the full value of the block. And then we figure out some way to return this to searchers. Now, I made I think the analogy you made was the Beaver build. Beaver build has a market making, they're originally a market maker, right? And that's how they ended up being a block builder. And the way it used to work for them is that they would, logically, well, it's the same entity, but logically their market making team would send a full 100% of the value bid to the block builder to basically pump up the block builder's value and to capture no value directly. And then the block builder would not bid the full block amount and capture that. And because they were integrated, the block builder's revenue was the same as the market making team's revenue, and so that's fine. And what was nice about that is that the block builder was doing the bidding, and the market making team didn't have to reason about this like two tiers of bidding, where they bid to the block builder and then the block builder has to bid, and it's more complicated. And so this mechanism would ideally be very similar, where the people who are sending transactions, who are sending bundles, don't have to reason so much about the block building. It's incentive compatible. They just report the full value of whatever they're doing, and then the mechanism just rewards them the VCG payment, or some payment that incentivizes them to report truthfully. But that's impossible, unfortunately, because of budget constraints, because of Sybils or false name attacks. But that's kind of the idea we would have loved to implement if it were possible, and are iterating towards, I guess. I think there's this specific aspect of BuilderNet, this economic design, is still like one of the more active research areas, for sure.
I see. But then I guess sort of it, so in that framing of, okay, so the value that the builder was going to receive is now sort of the value that is being distributed and from which the socialization is coming from. This kind of goes back to, I think, one of your earlier answers to Brad, which is that people opting into BuilderNet are presumably anticipating additional flow relative to what they would have gotten without BuilderNet.
Additional flow is maybe not the
transactions.
Right. So you mean from the infrastructure operator perspective, not from someone who's sending order flow?
Yeah. So like what I'm saying is if you frame it as, okay, so the proposer is going to get the same bids, but the balance is going to be split instead of just being given to the builder who's operating. Like, so, Beaver build not using BuilderNet, then it seems a bit odd that they would want to do it. But of course, one of the important points is that opting into BuilderNet probably affects the flow that they're receiving as a builder, right?
Yeah. So two things to say. The first is that if your primary revenue driver is market making, then that can continue just with a different execution mechanism now being built in it. But you make a valid point that people are now operating as infrastructure and are deriving value from ordering transactions that they didn't generate themselves. And now you're saying participate in the system, and the question is why would you do that? And again, I should say that I think the verdict is, or the jury's still out. We still need to find what makes the most sense. I think a lot, if what you're doing is sort of counterparty discovery or a matching transactions together in a way that generates value, you don't have to be running the block builder to do that. You just need to be able to process the flow. And so like I said, one thing we're exploring is having more of like a free market based approach where a lot of the logic is customizable in the block builder, and people are able to run their own logic and capture some of that, as long as they sort of adhere to the broader system design principles that give users the guarantees of using BuilderNet. So we have like some uniform guarantees, but still we allow for a free market to evolve. Yeah, that's the main point. I think I had another one. Maybe it'll come back to me and I'll say it. But I think that's the high level one. To be honest, we still need to figure it out. I think there's at the moment there's quite a tight integration between the like logic of what the infrastructure is doing and the infrastructure operators, which is not the same in other decentralized systems. Validators in Ethereum get paid just from issuance mostly. There's some MEV stuff, it's mostly issuance. And so you can sort of think about the application logic and the validators like two separate layers. Whereas if you look at like block builders, if you look at people running order flow auctions and all of these other things, MEV supply chain, right now the infrastructure and the sort of like business logic are very tightly coupled in terms of incentives. And it could end up in a world where we just end up, having a similar kind of issuance model where there's just people who are like stupidly running, not stupidly, but like, without much sophistication, just running a bunch of different infrastructure, and they actually don't consider the business logic. But it's hard to achieve that separation, because when you run the infrastructure, you have a lot of influence over things that impact the business logic. So an Ethereum validator, they can't do too much to influence the content of a block. Usually they're just doing attestations and these kinds of things. But if you're running a block builder node, you can situate yourself in a position where you are like at a good latency. You have low latency for some users to some proposals, or something like that. Or maybe you have an incentive to like interfere with the traffic coming in and out of a TE, like slowing it down or something. And those incentives definitely involve the business layer, the business logic. And so we probably need to think about those incentives cohesively. And we're thinking about it. But yeah, I think as you can tell, it's there's no spec written up to deal with this. Yeah.
It's one of those things Fahad was saying where it's like we'll do this, and then if you prove that it's wrong, then we'll patch it. But
yeah, I don't think we want to. We'd like to avoid the number of patches we have to issue per unit time. But I think that is sort of what we kind of almost have to do. We can't wait to design the perfect idealized system.
I agree. I'm just teasing Fahad. I feel like there's still so much to talk about, but I feel like we've already we're going on quite long. But there's one topic that I think we should get to, is the recent T attack. And I think this is the stuff that you've been active on Twitter about recently. So maybe you can. Or is it two separate things?
It kind of came up in my explanation of TEs earlier, where basically what happened is these quote unquote attacks. Like I said, they actually violated a property that none of the manufacturers claimed to even be trying to uphold. Like they carried out a physical access attack when these guys said we don't protect against physical access. I think it makes sense that people are still up in arms about it, because it shows, that there's a limitation in the security model. And it's fair to have something to say about that. But what I found frustrating is that people will look at, this news, there was a TE break, and firstly not understand at all what the break was, and how inherent it is in the technology versus just being a feature of a specific design decision. But generally people will say, look, TEs got broken today. This model that was iterated on from 2013 has been built for these high performance, low security use cases. It has issues, and so we rather should use FHE. But no one's using FHE in practice today. Right? And the comparison they're making is not between TEs today and FHE today. They're making it between TEs today and FHE, assuming a bunch of R&D and hardware acceleration, academic progress in X years time. And really the point I'm just trying to communicate is that if you use the same lens and said, okay, let's take an optimistic angle on technological development, and take some point in the future and say 5 years time, 10 years time, let's compare these technology on their merits. And when I say compare, I don't mean that it's mutually exclusive. I just mean that if you're justifying using a technology or investing in a technology, you want to have that be logically coherent with the other technologies you're investing in. So if you think that something, if something has properties A, B, and C, and therefore it's worth trying to develop it, then something which satisfies A, B, and C as well should also, receive some attention.
Totally.
Anyway, and I think that, I think that, sorry, this is a ranty topic for me, but I think the other thing is if you look at where TEs are being mentioned now, it's all of the big frontier labs. OpenAI put out a call for better TEs. Anthropic did some research on how to do confidential inference with TEs. Flashbots is using it, but Jitto that builds blocks on Solana is also using TEs. There's people are building these trustless agents with TEs. There's just a lot of advanced use cases that are being built on TEs. And yes, the security model isn't there, but the reason that people are using TEs is because it's the only efficient low latency mechanism for achieving privacy in a lot of these settings. We have these complex workloads. And as the crypto industry, what we're trying to do is to take things, properties like privacy or integrity over computations or whatever security property you want, and turn that into an interesting use case, a use case of value. And so we're saying we shouldn't use TEs at all. You're basically saying, we shouldn't experiment with these privacy primitives and just go back to using SLAs, which I don't think is the right approach. What we should be doing is accelerating investment into things that are better than the current TEs.
So if I can ask one last question here that maybe ties a few things we've been talking about together. The particular attack that you're talking about, so if I remember, it was an invasive hardware attack, right? Or
not even particularly invasive. They basically, there were two, but both of them sat between the chip and the off-chip RAM, the off-chip memory, and they just one was just listening to what was going back and forth, and the other one was redirecting traffic.
Okay, but is that attack at all relevant to BuilderNet?
Yeah, it's a generic attack on TEs. If you got into Azure today with your equipment and got to a TE, you would be able to extract valuable keys. It's not so obvious exactly how the attack would work because we're not permissionless, right? So even if you got into the network, we have existing TEs, and so now you'd extract a attestation key from them.
Right. So that's the obvious. I think in the super general sense, I presumed it was, but my point was do people actually have the access that they would need in the specific context of BuilderNet for this to be sort of?
There's a Twitter concept called the guy with the Glock, and that's part of the TE security model. And so if you're worried about Azure as an organization coming after you, then I think there's not that much you can do.
Right.
But if you're worried about someone who is on the other side of the guy with the Glock, I think practically they're on that many concerns. And then, then you can get into, okay, or the insider attacks and these kind of things. But the data centers are built in a way to protect against employees being bribed and doing nefarious things. So I think, I'm not, I don't lie awake at night thinking like, oh, they're going to break into the TEs tonight. But I think the real question is like, are we going to be able to ship good security primitives for these kinds of workloads in the reasonable timelines? Yeah.
Okay, just to wrap it up, I'll give you an opportunity to maybe give us some insight. I should have asked you this in the beginning, but Flashbots has been, I think, from what I've seen, been pushing this vision that T's are sort of like the future of blockchains and crypto are like the end game. And at least, maybe some of it is me inserting my own, take on it. But can you give us some insight into the Flashbots vision and how T's fit into it?
So let me talk about the TEs, and then I'll talk about how they fit into the vision. Firstly, what we're not saying is that you shouldn't use MPC or ZK or whatever other acronym cryptographic protocol or scheme you care about. Those are definitely valuable and important, and I think in our ideal vision we also end up leveraging those. But I think the Flashbots position, and I should say that it's a company of many people, and we don't really have party lines on things, so maybe some people will disagree, but I think broadly the take is TEs will always be a big part of what's happening like these secure systems for a variety of reasons. And in the path to getting to this sort of crypto cypherpunk utopia, TEs will play an exceptionally important role. And one of the reasons that it'll play an exceptionally important role is because we have them now. That's one reason. And so what is this like sort of broader vision that these are playing into? I think there's one thing to say about the block building world and the kind of access that people have to blockchains. And already we've seen like some institutions coming in. I think it was like Robinhood who cited control over MEV related infrastructure as like part of what they were deciding, one of the decision criteria for building on Arbitrum stack or something like that. But I think that the even broader vision is to say like, look, if you articulate the crypto vision as taking security primitives and using those to unlock economic surplus that wasn't there before, to enable counterparties who didn't interact before to interact, or to reduce the frictions of people interacting. If you take it as that broad statement, then you have to look at the kind of interactions that are out there and ask, okay, how many of these have information as an important component, and especially privacy of information. And if you you've done some mechanism design and game theory, you realize that like having people know your information often puts you in a worse position, often influences economic outcomes. A couple of years ago, the buzz phrase was the data is the new oil. And so a lot of the most valuable tech companies, the most valuable tech ecosystems are based around data. It's it's ads, it's AI, it's these kind of things. And in order for the crypto ecosystem to play into that, we need to have privacy tools. And most of these have latency as an important component. So low latency privacy is kind of the thing we're going after, and that's exactly what TEs strive to achieve. And what Flashbots is working on is sort of using that to facilitate interactions and coordination between different actors. And MEV is exactly that. You have people with different interests, and we're trying to get them all to play together. But there's a very large internet of people that are using information for various economic interactions. Or using digital access to digital information to get an upper hand, and that's sort of the broad space of things that we'd like to address. I would say that I think if you asked someone from the product team, they'd probably give like a less spacey answer.
Yeah.
But
no, that's why we
what
wanted
gets me
you
excited.
though. Yeah. No, this was awesome. I feel like this is exactly what I wanted, honestly. Fahad, do you think you know what T's are now?
I think I know more than at the beginning of the conversation, and so I think Quintus, you explained it. You got me farther in the last 2 hours than I have for the entirety of the last year that I've been trying to understand it better. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Right.
Hopefully this will be just as useful for anyone listening as well. But yeah, thanks so much, Quintus. Yeah, this is
thanks for letting me rant.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like we need to bring you back more. This was our longest episode, so that can tell you the value that you've at least given for both of us. So
yeah. Let's hope someone suffering through the 2 hours feels the same.
Yeah. Well, they'll listen to 2x, so yeah.
All
Cool.
right, cheers,
Okay.
guys. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Quintus.
Thank you. You actually did just